So, what does the guy who ran Europe's border agency for 7 years think is fundamentally wrong with its migration policy? Well, today we're breaking down the pretty striking diagnosis from Fabrice Leggeri, the former head of Frontex. Okay, let's dive right in. This one sentence from Leggeri really captures the heart of his entire argument. He basically believes Europe is just managing the symptoms, not actually solving the problem. And he uses a really specific, really dramatic example to prove his point. Fabrice Leggeri wasn't just some outside commentator. He was the insider. He ran Frontex for 7 whole years. And that's exactly what makes his critique of the very system he directed so incredibly powerful. So let's get into his analysis. To really illustrate his point, Leggeri takes us to the Canary Islands, which, as you know, is a Spanish territory just off the coast of Africa. He kind of presents this place as a microcosm of a much larger systemic failure. And the number he points to is just staggering. Over 25,000 people a year arriving on this one route alone. And you have to remember, these journeys are incredibly dangerous. We're talking up to 1,000 kilometers across the open Atlantic, often in small, unsafe boats. So what's the result on the ground? Well, Leggeri's assessment is pretty stark. The local infrastructure is completely overwhelmed. It's just unable to cope with the sheer volume of people arriving. And to make this really concrete, he gives this stunning example from the tiny island of El Hierro. While he was visiting a port there, he found that in less than a week, more migrants had arrived than the 2,000 inhabitants who actually live there. I mean, that's just a powerful image of the scale he's trying to describe. Okay, so that's the diagnosis, but what does Leggeri believe is the cause? This is where his critique becomes a direct accusation against the official policy of the European Union itself. He argues there's a fundamental conflict of mission. See, in his view, Frontex's job should be border protection, actively stopping illegal departures and entries. But he claims the EU's actual policy is what he calls migration management, which focuses on registering and processing people after they've already arrived. You see the difference? One is all about prevention, the other is all about reception. So, here's the crucial point. Why this focus on reception? Leggeri doesn't see this as some practical failure. No, he sees it as an intentional choice, driven by what he calls an immigrationist ideology in Brussels that he believes fundamentally prioritizes welcoming migrants over stopping them. But according to Leggeri, it's not just the policymakers in Brussels. He points his finger at another really powerful set of actors on the ground, non-governmental organizations, NGOs. He sees these NGOs not simply as humanitarian charities, but as a core part of the problem. In his analysis, they are a powerful interest group with their own agenda, and they've, in his words, effectively privatized a huge part of Europe's migration response. And he lays out a whole series of specific claims here. He argues that NGOs aren't just charities, they function more like businesses that actually rely on migrant arrivals to survive. Operationally, he alleges they interfere with official security checks. Politically, they lobby against enforcement. And maybe most critically, he claims they act as a pull factor, actively guiding migrants toward countries with the best social aid, which in turn encourages the journey. This all leads to Leggeri's really striking conclusion that there is a whole economic ecosystem that lives off these migrant arrivals. He sees this self-perpetuating cycle where a bunch of different groups have a financial stake in continuous migration, creating what he calls an aspirational comp. So, after diagnosing the problem and identifying the players he sees as responsible, what's Leggeri's solution? Let's move on to his prescription for fixing this. His core proposal is a radical shift in focus. He says, forget pouring more money into reception centers on European soil. The entire mission, he argues, has to be reoriented to stop the boats from successfully making the crossing in the first place. He outlines a pretty clear 4-step plan. It starts with surveillance, spotting departures with planes and drones. Then immediate interception and rescue at sea. But here's the critical final step, returning the rescued people right back to their African port of departure. Leggeri argues this is actually more humane because it saves lives by preventing that dangerous ocean crossing, and it completely breaks the business model of the traffickers. So you might be asking, why isn't this happening already? Well, according to Leggeri, the technology and the operational capacity, it all exists. The only missing ingredient is the political will. He argues that leaders in Brussels and in national capitals just have to decide to prioritize what he calls firmness and give a clear, unambiguous mission to their border forces. And that leaves us with the final, crucial question. Fabrice Leggeri, he's no longer an EU official. He's actually a politician himself now. As we see this political shift happening across Europe towards tougher stances on migration, you have to wonder, will the diagnosis of this ultimate insider go from just being a warning to becoming official policy?